I'll be giving the first sermon, and Reverend will be giving the second one. And off of shared screen. I worked on a construction site the first summer after my first year of college. It was hard work and turned my hands to blisters. The money was great, $2.50 an hour at a time when the minimum wage was only $1.60 an hour. I made enough money that summer to pay for an entire semester of college. The foreman took a liking to me and a friend of mine, and we got on the desirable crew to raise prefabricated concrete walls. The work was hard and dangerous. One day the foreman came to me and asked, "Are you afraid of heights?" I said no. And he had me work to bolt together some steel I-beams. Now, if you've ever done this, it's really different walking on a 9-inch wide steel beam laying on the ground versus one that's 14 feet in the air. I discovered that I was really not afraid of heights, but I was very afraid of falling. It turns out that the ironworkers union couldn't supply enough workers. So just to tick the union off, the foreman put me up on the iron so the union would bring out more workers. When the workers arrived, I was removed from walking that 9-inch beam, and I also became hated by all the ironworkers on the site. My first time of being a sacrificial worker for someone else's purpose. I have fears. I wasn't afraid of heights until I was on that beam in the air. I say I'm not afraid of dying, but I've never died, so I don't really know. Maybe I am. I'm afraid of losing my ability to take care of myself. It worries me as I age. I'm afraid of catching COVID. I'm afraid of a lingering, painful disease because I do not like pain. I am afraid of running out of time, and so often I rush around with great haste and carelessness. But I do not consider any of my fears irrational. They're just part of who I am. My fears are not irrational. You know what an irrational fear is? It's one that I do not have. 99.1% of Americans have a phobia of some sort that negatively impacts their life. There's this great study about phobias that surveyed 70,000 people by gender and age and found that females are about twice as likely to have a phobia of any kind than are males. And I'll let you decide what that might mean. But I want to talk about a particular fear, the fear of the future. It has a great name, chronophobia, and it can negatively impact your life from general anxiety to being life-consuming and crippling. Now, fear of the future has been on a good, solid upward trend in modern society as people succumb to the pressures of lives that are heavily dependent upon material wealth and factors that are not directly controllable by their efforts. The unknown future for many individuals creates fear. This type of fear can start to control lives, and people can become too scared to take the pathways they really want to in life for fear of the risk involved or the uncertainty and the outcomes associated with change. People live lives that are compromised, never daring to change or step into the roles that they inwardly desire, leading to feelings of being unfulfilled. And in my life, I have never had more fear about the uncertainty of the future than now. For me, it's about the news. Consuming news today has become a health hazard. For starters, it heightens my worry about safety, which sometimes spirals into full-blown anxiety. This is worse if you've ever experienced a trauma in the past, because news like we're hearing can be a trigger to revive a past trauma. This is a fear that I struggle with in 2020. It's like being close to a train wreck. I'm too afraid to look, but I'm too scared to look away. I try and avoid the news, but I keep peeking. Chronophobia. This, for me, is another pandemic in 2020. It's chronophobia, and it feels like we're justified in our fear. But the flames of fear are being fed and fanned, and we're making decisions and taking actions that are not based on compassion and love. There's no vaccine for this one, but there are precautions that you need to take to remain safe. For me, fear of the future is a self-fulfilling prophecy. When I become afraid of what might happen, the fear consumes me. The more I'm afraid, the less present I am. And the less present I am, the more of life I miss. I take a long walk every Wednesday morning, and we walk by a junior high school, and on the chain link fence on that school is this giant vine that's been there for I don't know how long. And there's a certain time of year when the green leaves turn this incredibly brilliant red. I noticed one day walking by it on a Wednesday morning that the leaves were red. They're only red for a short time, but I almost missed it because I was so consumed with my thoughts and my fears. I've trained myself to wear a mask whenever I go out. This is to avoid catching and spreading COVID. I am training myself to be present and aware. This is to avoid a crippling fear of the future. I want to make a difference in this world. I want to leave this planet better place than it is today. But I cannot achieve my purposes in life when fear pushes away my faith. I cannot fulfill my calling if fear cripples me, and neither can you. The fruits of my life will come from the deeds and seeds that I've sown. I do not want to sow fear. I do not want to miss out on any of this limited time that I have on this precious life. I pray for the same in your life. Amen, and blessed be. Now I invite Ryan, Rev Ryan, to unmute himself for our sermon part 2.
Good morning, guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I was actually, it's fitting that Russ, you talked about fear of heights, because my initial plan for this was I was going to go on the West Cliff and try to do an overhang and get a good view of a cliff hanging experience to get all the you. I think the word is acrophobia is fear of heights. So I was going to get everybody with an acrophobia, get their heart rate up for today's service. I ran into another fear, a modern fear, and that's the fear of no internet connectivity. So I had to scurry for my second plan, which is actually super fitting given our dynamic today of looking at the fruits of the Spirit. So I'm here today at the Homeless Garden Project, a beautiful place to look at the harvest and the fruits of the Spirit. And also, as we dive in a little deeper, a place to look at our fear of each other and misperception, something I wanted to focus on a little bit. And with the fruit of the Spirit, I actually just accidentally found a fruit that I'm scared of. This is a prickly pear. I just accidentally stepped on it. So that kind of gets into the Spirit. But I'm going to go over here to my little perch in the harvest light with the ducks and so forth behind me. And, oh, relax. And I've got my corn stalk, and we're going to dive in. So one of the things that we're approaching in this season of Halloween, this season of harvest, but also this season of the pandemic, is just what Russ alluded to in the end, a mask culture. In the past, we've been told around Halloween time to fear the mask, fear the people in the mask. Those are scary people. They're ghouls and goblins. They're serial killers on bad horror movies. We've always been told to fear the mask. Well, all of a sudden in our society, we've reached this time when we're being told to fear the person without the mask. That's a scary thing now too. So when you think about it, we're in this weird place in society, this purgatorial state where we're told to fear the people with the mask, the people without the mask. We're told to fear everything. So in approach of this Halloween season, there's actually a phobia called maskophobia. That's a true statement. And the tradition of Halloween masks, just so you guys know, was passed down from the Celtic culture, who used disguises and scary things to try to confuse ghosts that came out on Samhain, the festival at the end of the harvest season. So yeah, as we sit here in this harvest season being told to fear everything with and without a mask, I also wanted to jump into the sociological perspective of today's service. We looked at the personal before this, but society-wise, much of our fear, and speaking from a church perspective, is religious. And it's a fascinating dynamic to look at fear-based religions. How many of the religions that we were brought up on, these mainline religions, were based upon fear? And this is a really interesting dynamic when you look at the East and West cultures. But yeah, fear-based religions. Think of the street corner prophet speaking words of fear and tribulation and an end. We fear the end. One thing important before we go on is to never judge somebody based on their fear. That's a really, really key point. Yeah, these fear-based religions. The Muslim tradition is actually a really interesting one when we look at this. It's known as the most fear-based of the religions. And one Moroccan scholar, Fatima Merisi, wrote about Islam and the fear-based kind of implications on contemporary culture. And she listed a couple. The 7 major ones: the fear of the foreign West, which we live in, fear of Allah, fear of democracy, fear of freedom of thought, individualism, the past, and the present. Much like the no mask thing, you're almost told to fear everything. It's kind of interesting when we go into the Judeo-Christian culture as well. Just one of the many passages out of Proverbs. How blessed is the man who fears God always, but he who hardens his heart will fall in calamity. We're told to fear in Western culture. Counter this with Buddhism, where fear and desire are actually the root of suffering, and life is about overcoming them. There's a beautiful story looking at this idea of fear of end. It says, a fierce and terrifying band of samurai was riding through the countryside, bringing fear and harm wherever they went. As they were approaching one particular town, all the monks in the town's monastery fled except for the abbot. When the band of warriors entered the monastery, they found the abbot sitting at the front of the shrine in perfect posture. The fierce leader took out his sword and said, "Don't you know who I am? Don't you know that I'm the sort of person who could run through you with my sword without batting an eye?" The Zen master then looked calmly and said, "And I, sir, am the sort of man who could be run through by a sword without batting an eye." fearlessness. Fear is very perceptual. So let's jump back into those Western religious cultures for a second as an example of this. The word is yara, fear in Hebrew, yara. You see, and that word is actually awe. It's the root of awesome. It's fear, but from a perspective of just exhilaration, excitement. Fear, yes. So fear is perception in these cultures. And when we jump into kind of where we're at right now, here at the Homeless Garden Project, I can't help but to realize the fears we have of each other, beyond the mask or no mask. Looking at society as a whole right now, the racial riots that we're experiencing, what we're doing to one another is not necessarily based on fear of that person, but unfortunately it's based on fear of perception of that person. And we have to be so careful in our society not to let our inner fears restrict us from getting to know somebody of who we think we're scared of. Doing something of which we think we can't do. And how do we do that? Is a big question. But how do we let our fears not hurt one another is huge. So I closed this story with a little tidbit. I actually got stung by a bee. I wasn't gonna go into this story, but as I was walking out here, I got stung by a bee. And it brought back to light the story of how the bee got its stinger. Many of you might have heard this in the past. So a queen bee is going through the fields, looking over, and there was a drought. And she realized that there weren't going to be flowers that year, and they wouldn't be able to pollinate and make honey. So the queen bee looked up to the sky and she goes, God, give us rain so that the flowers bloom and we can pollinate and make honey and live in abundance. So the great creator of bees rained down on the flowers and they blossomed and they had a glorious spring, flowers, pollination, and a hive full of honey. So the queen bee looked around at all the creatures, great and small, of whom she didn't understand. And she said, oh my gosh, God, you must grant me a stinger, for all these animals are hungry and they're going to want my honey. So the creator once again granted the bee her wish, but he said, I will grant you a stinger based on your fear, but you too will perish when you sting. And I think that's a great way to close out today is what are we scared of and how can we not let our fears sting another, because we too shall perish. I hand you back to the service, and I'm gonna go put some sunscreen on because I fear sunburn as a redhead, and many blessings on this week to come. So thanks be to all of you, and amen.